Oh, okay.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. Let me see if I get the right link. Oh, yeah, it says we're live. Oh, but it's so far away. Maybe put it closer to Charles. Huh? It's going. It's live.
What do you want?
Maybe.
What is it supposed to be saying?
That presentation.
So what does it say? I don't think they're all the same.
Oh, fuck. No, it's okay. It's okay.
Wait, was this not plugged in?
No, it was.
Oh.
Let's get the drink away from all this stuff.
I put in the wrong link.
What is that for the slides?
Sorry, Charles. Okay. Okay, but yeah, put it sorry. Let's do this.
What is this supposed to be?
It's a. Oh, what?
Here,
Okay.
I see what you're trying to do.
Yeah.
And so someone's here running the 5-1 talks.
I can do that. Yes. So it's gonna be.
This
happened last time too.
Oh, it's starting to connect now? Jesus Christ. I know you know.
I can sit here and get five.
Let me just double check.
Do you want me to check the YouTube stream?
It looks like it's. Oh yeah.
I'm gonna have to see you.
Oh, are you doing it?
Yeah.
Okay.
You're the chair.
I don't
The chair gotta be free. You know? Yes, sir. You see, they just have to do.
You brought that stool? Actually, Kat, never mind. I wouldn't be able to move it with the cable.
You gotta tell me what to. Just blink twice.
This is as good as it's gonna get. But can they hear us? Is the question. Oh yeah, it's really loud. Okay, I think ours is.
Looks good.
I hate that.
What is that?
That's just.
Oh, it's fine. People gotta. Why are you giving?
Are you introducing?
No, the chair is. The chair is.
Oh yeah, that's me.
No, the chair is this person. Wait, why is it so loud?
Sorry, I'll turn it down.
Yeah.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming on a very rainy day. I know it can be
hard to get around LA when you're we are All Power Books. We are a communist bookstore and community space. We are not for profit, and everything we do is for the community by the community. We do events such as teach-ins, reading circles, author Q&As, movie screenings, a little bit of everything. And we also do a weekly grocery distribution. We have a community fridge. We have a free store, and everything that we make from the store goes directly back into our program. So if you are able to donate, we really appreciate it a lot. We are people funded. And yeah, so today we have Charles from Child Collective. So I'll let him go ahead and introduce himself. And we also have a vendor in the back, Tiger Stepmom, who is raising funds
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kat. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming out on this super rainy day, and also for taking a break from being glued to your screens regarding Iran's self-defense operation earlier today. I was a little miffed at them for launching it, as I was finishing up these slides, because I wanted to give them my full undivided attention, but my procrastinating ass did not allow that to happen. So if anything goes down during the talk that I need to know about, feel free to interrupt me. All that said, my name is Charles Shu. I am a member of Child Collective. We are a collective of communists in the Chinese diaspora, founded back in 2020, primarily to combat imperialist narratives surrounding China, but also to uphold the legacy of Chinese socialism and what is most relevant to the subject today, Chinese internationalism. And yeah, so this talk is going to be based on an article that came out a bit over a month ago by me on our website entitled "The Gates of the Great Continent, Palestine, China, and the War for Humanity's Future." You can find that at childcollective.com, child spelled QIAO. There's a lot more backgrounds to the stuff that I'm talking about there, though there have been a couple of developments since then and a couple of things that I've discovered, which are going to be new in this talk. So, if you've already read the article, all 15,000 words of it or whatever, because I'm so fucking long-winded, there will still be Easter eggs in here for you. So, with that said, let's get going. I wanted to start off actually with a question for the room, or sort of two questions, very interrelated, that really get at sort of my thought process when I was, thinking through this article, right? It was really how that article came into being. And the questions that I want to pose to everyone is, how do your people relate to the Palestinian struggle? And if your people do relate or do identify with the cause of Palestinian liberation, then why do they do so? And here, I want to keep it very open-ended, right? And anyone who wants to answer, you can interpret your people however you like to do so, right? Whether you're part of some diaspora group in the United States, whether you are thinking of including the people of the home country or not, right? Lots of different, different national origins, certainly in the room, lots of different possible answers to this question. I'm just curious what answers people have. Anyone?
I'm of the Irish diaspora, and that country and those people identify very strongly with the Palestinian struggle against a settler colonial state that has taken over their homeland, and they're trying to get them out.
Absolutely. Thank you. Shukriya.
Seconding Irish diaspora, I think the Irish people have held on really strong to remembering that to be silent is to be complicit, and that means you are part of the oppression, because people were silent about their imperial takeover, and that was, yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you. Anyone else want to jump in? Also, should I be passing this mic around for? Is there anything I can reach? Okay, it might be a little difficult. Yeah, go ahead, Gage.
I
I'm Vietnamese, and Vietnam was one of the first countries to diplomatically recognize Palestine as in the global diplomatic stage. To this day, we maintain really close diplomatic ties with Palestinian people. Also, there's a lot of parallels with being a smaller, like outgunned country, defeating a much larger, more advanced power for the independence.
Absolutely. Thank you, Gage. Anyone else want to jump in?
Yeah, Korean. And I was just thinking to other people about this earlier, but so like Korean people call Korea as like Hangul, which means like the land of Han. And Han actually translates directly to the back, that is very specific. It doesn't translate over in English. And the back is like very specific to those who have been colonized over and over. And for that reason, like knowing that fact again, like that the colonizer was not possessed in their vocabulary, I think that's where this all comes from.
That's really beautiful. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, so that's a good collection of answers to this. I think, yeah, next slide. We've touched on, between the different answers, we touched on most of these. There's the fact of seeing a common enemy in imperialism, or in some cases in Zionism specifically, right? This is only true for other Arab nations, right? True for a lot of Latin American countries as well, whose right-wing military dictatorships were backed to the hilt by Israel. There's historical parallels in our history of colonization and of liberation struggles against it, right? That's common to everything that we heard, right? Korea, Vietnam, and Ireland. There is the strong history of people-to-people solidarity, right? Which within Europe in particular, Ireland very much stands out for that. And then for some of us, with our home countries, there's a strong history of state-to-state relations or state-to-people relations with Palestine and with the Palestinian struggle, right? That's true certainly for Vietnam. For Korea in general, it's been the case for the DPRK, right? And really, when I was formulating this article, researching it, I realized that there are elements of all of these that I want to bring in and to basically construct a coherent narrative out of, right? And so, to that end, there are a couple of very salient quotes that I think address points that people have already brought up here, right? There's this one by Hassan Khalfani, the famous Palestinian novelist, writer, spokesman for the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. He famously said that imperialism has laid its body over the world, the head in East Asia, the heart in the Middle East, its arteries reaching Africa and Latin America. Wherever you strike it, you damage it, and you serve the world revolution. The Palestinian cause is not a cause for Palestinians only, but a cause for every revolutionary. Now think about that image that he's evoking with that first line, right? About imperialism as an active agent, as like an organic body stretching over the world. And then if you look at this next quote from Chairman Mao Zedong, which he delivered in 1965 to a visiting delegation from the Palestine Liberation Organization. He used very similar imagery, right? He said imperialism is afraid of China and of the Arabs. Israel and Formosa, the antiquated name for Taiwan, are bases of imperialism in Asia. You are the gate of the great continent, and we are the rear. They created Israel for you and Formosa for us. Their goal is the same. So they're very much identifying both the geographical reach of imperialism, the scope, the global scope of the struggle, and a point that I really wanted to draw out in this article is incorporating Palestine into this very expansive vision of Pan-Asian liberation. Next slide. That said, obviously this talk and this article that's based on concern Palestine and China in particular, and we know that both are very much in the news, and categorically stigmatized, right, in mainstream narratives in particular. So I'm kind of curious before diving in, what narratives people have heard, right, whether in the mainstream, well, mostly in the mainstream media, but also possibly some alternative or independent media, right, about China and Palestine since October 7th. Savannah?
Oh, sorry, I didn't read this.
Oh.
But I was gonna say, what I heard so much is that China has cured cancer, but at what cost?
Mm.
But that doesn't have anything to do with that. Sorry.
No worries. Yeah. Certainly lots of attacks on China's developmental model, which is relevant. Yeah. Anyone else want to throw out like a China-Palestine related headline? Okay.
That October 7th was an unprompted attack by Hamas.
Yeah. Any others? Like, especially any that involve China and Palestine together. You know, I'm kind of curious. There's obviously
I got an interesting one.
Yeah.
It's how people, how there's a genocide happening in Palestine, literally, but then they try to say there's a genocide happening in China by the Uyghur Muslims.
That's exactly right. It is a narrative that has been revived, in order to, in some ways, ride on the wave, right, and to muddle the definition of genocide. That's something that we can get to more in the Q&A. But yeah, definitely a spurious connection that people have been trying to draw, right? Any other?
One of them is that China is using TikTok to turn Americans against
Yes, thank you. TikTok is a huge one. With that, actually, it's a perfect segue into the next section, on information war and digital sovereignty. And then specifically the next slide, boom, this is an article or an op-ed by Republican House Representative Mike Gallagher, raising precisely that claim, right, that young Americans support Hamas, quote unquote. I mean, yes, we do. But it's obviously phrased very, very provocatively in this sense, right? And blaming it on TikTok, right? This is very related as well to this incident from actually all the way back in October, where some pro-ceasefire protesters were outside Nancy Pelosi's house, and she told them to, quote, go back to China, where your funders are, or something like that. In any case, the common narrative being propounded here in both cases is that China is, basically engaged in pro-Palestine, or more specifically pro-resistance, pro-Hamas influence operations. And the way that this is phrased is very interesting, right? Because it's attacking like the China-based ownership of TikTok, right, and its parent company ByteDance. But included within that critique is this idea that this is actually a U.S. specific thing, right? Because in this article by Mike Gallagher, he talks about how there's a sanitized, quote unquote, version of TikTok in China called Douyin, which is very different in terms of content. And he says, quote, ByteDance and the CCP have decided that China's children get spinach and America's get digital fentanyl. So, evoking kind of like a weird reverse opium war thing, but also conceding that the real issue here, right, is that the Chinese internet, and the Chinese information ecosystem is stubbornly beyond the reach of American censorship. Very unlike the platforms that the U.S., the West, and indeed most of the world are forced to use, right? Whether that be, Twitter/X, all the meta platforms, Facebook, Instagram. This is a different category, and it's an attack, therefore, on China's digital sovereignty, right? So if we go to the next slide, another narrative that came up regarding, this mysterious world of Chinese-based apps and their entanglement with Gaza came in this, characteristically hyperbolic Daily Mail headline: Chinese companies purge Israel from maps of the Middle East amid surging anti-Semitism in the communist state. And really, their complaint was that, these mapping apps, right, made by Alibaba and Baidu, If you zoom in on the region, you see like the names of all the surrounding countries, but you don't see Israel. You don't see Palestine either, actually. Their claim was that this was a post-October 7th thing. It actually is not. And it's really a function of Israel's refusal to define its own borders and the illegitimacy of its existing ones. You can see, for example, here on the right, on the Baidu Maps version of this, that it includes the West Bank and Gaza cutout, but it also has the maps of the UN partition plan from 1947, which only allotted the Jewish state 55% of historic Palestine and not the 78% that it claimed in the Nakba, right? So this obviously overblown, but it does go to show actually that the mapping apps that we are forced to use, Google and Apple Maps primarily, are in fact fully in the tank for both the Zionist narrative and their literal view of physical space. Next slide. Yeah, so regarding this narrative of online anti-Semitism in China, you also have this New York Times story, which specifically is essentially blaming China for not implementing the kind of censorship that America wants, right? It says it's hard to say whether the anti-Israeli position in state media and anti-Semitism on the Chinese internet, by which they mean anti-Zionism, are part of a coordinated campaign. And then it says, China's hair-triggered internet censors are keenly attuned to the wishes of its leaders, right? So the idea here being that we don't have an unfiltered view of what Chinese people think, but by choosing not to censor anti-Zionist comments, right, anti-Zionist posts, the Chinese government is indicating which way it leans. Next slide. Now, it is true actually that sentiment on the Chinese internet is overwhelmingly pro-Palestine, and it helps in this regard that China has developed this degree of digital sovereignty, has built its own platforms behind what's called the Great Firewall. And behind that firewall, though still accessible to us, is a whole universe of actually interesting pro-Palestine content that, unfortunately, we're not very exposed to. For example, a lot of internet artists who produce stuff like this. This is called The Great Flood. It came out only 10 days after October 7th. That was pretty sick. And then next slide. Also, rather movingly, a lot of very, very cool tributes to Aaron Bushnell after he self-immolated in front of the Israeli embassy in DC. Yeah, basically communicating really the global significance of that act, right, and the ways in which it resonated with the Chinese people as well. You also have the story from Voice of America, literally a U.S. state outlet, and how Chinese bloggers glorify Hamas with cosplay and posts. So on the right is an actual post on Douyin, which says, Hamas undefeated. Here's a screenshot from a Bilibili video by a Hamas enthusiast who goes through their combat videos and commentates on them in great detail. I did put a link to that down in the corner, but it might be a little iffy to click on that and out of the presentation. We can try it, yeah.
Oh shit!
Oh, no worries. Yeah, let's see. Yeah, so no English stuff, unfortunately. But yeah, so you're doing like a very detailed technical analysis here, comparative analysis of the Hamas C-105 with other RPG models. Right, I think that's enough. Yeah, there's a link to the full video in my article And this gives a flavor, right, of the fact that behind the firewall there exists this entire internet ecosystem, carefully cultivated in many ways, but giving rise to this organic solidarity with the Palestinian resistance that is shared by literally over 1 billion internet users, right? And that in itself, even if that internet is somewhat sundered from ours, it presents a threat to the Zionist control of the narrative.
Yeah, why can we die?
No worries.
Don't need to talk about.
Right. So yeah, that actually is just one facet of several dimensions, right, of the relationship between China, its people, and the Palestinian resistance, which get systematically distorted, right, through Western tellings of it. Another narrative that comes up often, we want to go to the next slide, is that of overt Chinese diplomatic support for Palestinian resistance. Go to the next slide. So here's an example. This is the leader of the Hamas Politburo, Ismail Haniyeh, whose sons and grandchildren were recently martyred by Israel, meeting before then with a Chinese envoy in Qatar called Wang Kejian. And it says here, this is actually an excerpt from Resistance News Network, so an actually reliable media outlet. But very important point here at the bottom, referring to the Chinese envoy, he says he confirmed that the Hamas movement is part of the Palestinian national fabric and on China's keenness on the relationship with it. So this of course is a direct refutation, right, of the attempt to place Hamas, right, and all resistance formations as beyond the pale, right, to categorize them as terrorists. Another very vocal statement of this came recently before the International Court of Justice. Go to the next slide. From this guy, Ma Qinmin, who I think is a legal advisor to the Chinese Foreign Ministry, and who had this to say regarding the ICJ case about Israel's occupation of Palestine. Yeah, so this is in the middle of the session about the legality of the Israeli occupation, right? And while he is making his argument quite legalistically in a way that rhetorically is maybe a little different from how Chinese diplomats in the Mao period would have articulated this, it is a political choice, right, to highlight specifically the legitimacy of armed struggle in that context. And I think it's a very welcome statement. I think Hamas also explicitly welcomed that intervention. Next slide. So then there are also insinuations, more speculatively, of direct material support to the Palestinian resistance today, right? And I'm going to be getting into the subject of the historical support back in the Mao period later. For that, there's abundant evidence, and everyone was very forward about it. In this case, these are mostly like Zionist and Western narratives insinuating that China is actually intervening in some material fashion, right, in favor of the resistance. For example, you have this article in Ynet, right, on de facto sanctions that are reportedly being imposed on Israel's tech sector by Chinese suppliers. You have this, other statement by a former head of Shin Bet, that, quote, when the time is right, China may be able to stop the operations of critical infrastructure in Israel, particularly the port of Haifa, which is shown on the right there. And this does get into something of an uncomfortable topic, which is the degree of, of economic interpenetration that the, Chinese and Israeli economies have, the fact that they have diplomatic relations and economic relations. I'm not going to get too much into the backstory of that in this talk, but very, very open to questions about it, because we do have to sit with those complexities and contradictions. However, what this is suggesting, right, is that it also affords China a lot of leverage, that can be applied should it, decide to go sort of all in the tank, right, for the Palestinian cause. Next slide. And then we have some other narratives in this vein, right? Very early on, in fact, as you can see, this is October 8th, right? There was already speculation that in preparing for Al-Aqsa flood, Hamas and the rest of the Palestinian resistance were able to hide their communications from the all-encompassing Israeli surveillance, right, over all electronic communications in the Gaza Strip by using Huawei phones. Huawei being the Chinese telecoms company that has been under punishing U.S. sanctions recently. I frankly don't think this is true, and it's been pretty well documented that the actual approach taken by the resistance was to go sort of intentionally low tech, right, to play into Israel's kind of arrogant techno solutionism and its certainty that it would be able to pick up on any and all planning for an operation of this size. But it does speak to again the ubiquity of these narratives, right? And you have other insinuations, that many of the weapons used by the Palestinian resistance are of Chinese manufacture. This is actually almost certainly true, right? But it speaks to, I guess, just the size of the Chinese arms industry in general. The fact that, it is, not as tightly directed towards one side as that of the U.S. And yeah, also some speculation that Ansar Allah in Yemen, uses weapons that are ultimately of Chinese origin. While there may be some truth in these, I want to emphasize as well, and I go into this a lot more in the article, that what's actually really extraordinary, right, about the arsenals that the axis of resistance in general, and especially the resistance in Gaza, have accumulated, is that they are by and large indigenously produced with the means that they have, including under the punishing blockade of Gaza, which supposedly targets materials of military use, even though we know it also includes medicine, food, humanitarian aid, everything, right? And the story of how the resistance, and in particular the Islamist factions of the resistance, very intentionally cultivated their own corps of engineers, right? And were able to repurpose unexploded Israeli ordnance and basically the materials that they had lying around, right? To a point where 6 months into this genocidal campaign, they are still able to fire rockets at Israel is nothing short of extraordinary. And yeah, again, there's more on that in my article. But for the time being, I guess what I want to concentrate on is not so much these more speculative narratives about direct material support, right, for the resistance, but the ideological inheritance that the resistance today, has acquired, right, from China's own experience of People's War, both that of the Communist Party against the nationalists in the Chinese Civil War, the Kuomintang, and in particular against the Japanese invasion during the Second Sino-Japanese War. And to that end, slide, I want to highlight that this is something that even sort of modern day icons, right, of the Palestinian resistance have very openly spoken to. This is Basar al-Araj, a revolutionary intellectual who was martyred, I think, in 2019. And just a year before, he wrote about essentially the practice of guerrilla war as articulated by Mao. He says that the conundrum of how a nation that is not industrial would win over an industrial nation was solved by Mao. That Mao emphasized time, space, and the will. What that means is to avoid large battles, leaving ground in favor of time, using time to build up will. That is the essence of asymmetrical war and guerrilla war. And this, I think, is abundantly in evidence in everything that we've seen since October 7th. And I kind of want to spend some time exploring specific facets of that now. In particular, there's the question of what Gaza represents to the Palestinian resistance, right? We know that even before October 7th, it was an open-air concentration camp for over 2 million people. We know that it's since been converted overtly into a death camp for the civilian population. But it represents more than that. And I think the people of Gaza would be the first to emphasize that fact, right? That what we're seeing on our screens now does not represent the totality of what Gaza means to Palestine. And that in fact, a crucial part of its significance is that it's always been, a base of the resistance, right? It has been since 2006, since the, nominal Israeli withdrawal, a de facto liberated territory, still under siege, but under, the governance of an actual resistance faction, right? Which could use it as a revolutionary base area. It has been a focal point more recently of a regional axis of resistance that extends well beyond Palestine. And it is also what, the Palestinian people call the popular cradle of the resistance. So I want to sort of go through all these different aspects and then relate them to the writings of Mao, right? On guerrilla war, because there are a lot of resonances here that struck me almost immediately when I started researching this with the help of comrades in the Palestinian youth movement. But yeah, so first off, liberated territory, right? Next slide. So in his treatise on guerrilla warfare, written in 1937, right at the start of the Japanese invasion, Mao said that in the course of the invasion, the lost territories can be restored only by a strategical counterattack, and this we cannot carry out until the enemy is well into China. The enemy being Japan, of course. Consequently, some part of our country, or indeed most of it, may be captured by the enemy and become his rear area. It is our task to develop intensive guerrilla warfare over this vast area and convert the enemy's rear into an additional front. Thus, the enemy will never be able to stop fighting. And this should definitely remind us of the dynamic that we've seen since October 7th. It resonates a lot as well with the writings of, I think, one of the most original and perceptive analysts of the current situation, Max Eil, who wrote back in November that the resistance has alloyed ideological commitment, willingness to sacrifice for the people, and technological ingenuity into armed capacity capable of going head-to-head with a nuclear power from underground tunnels, which constitute the rear base and physical strategic depth needed for guerrilla insurgency. The concrete is their mountains. And I want to mention specifically that this concept of strategic depth that he's talking about, right? It basically means having the lateral space to advance and retreat, right? Having a rear area, having supply lines, all of which the Gaza Strip very conspicuously lacks, right? Being surrounded on all sides, either by the Zionist regime or by its collaborators, right? Such that its lack of lateral strategic depth had to be compensated for by vertical strategic depth. And that's why we have this vast tunnel network that has allowed the resistance to sustain its operations again through over 6 months. We go to the next slide. we see here on the left a heat map of resistance operations just in the last month, right? Which was put together by Institute for Study of War, which is like a DC-based Western think tank. So this is, if anything, an understatement of the intensity of resistance. Those purple and red splotches that happen to coincide exactly with those blue areas that Israel has claimed to have operational control over for months, right? And indeed, so intense has the resistance been, especially in the south and Khan Yunis, that as I think most of us are aware, Israel recently pulled almost all its ground forces out of Gaza, right? It always comes forward with these narratives that it did so on its own initiative, but we know that's total bullshit. And here on the right, is this tweet by John Elmer. He is with the Electronic Intifada. I recommend everyone follow his resistance dispatches. But he's mentioning how basically the physical destruction of Gaza's infrastructure, right, which is such a testament to the genocidal nature of their campaign, has in fact created a landscape, above ground as well as below in the tunnels, that is actually maximally conducive to these, guerrilla operations, and which the resistance has been using to those ends. But the story about strategic depth, right, in relation to Gaza is not limited geographically just to Gaza itself, and that's because of the axis of resistance, right? So there's a relevant Mao quote that I just kind of stumbled upon when I was skimming through another work of his on protracted war, also written in relation to the Japanese invasion. And this is part of a longer analysis that he has of encirclement and counter-encirclement at bigger and bigger scales, right? So that's the context. If the name of Weiqi, he says, which is go, is extended to include the world, there is yet a third form of encirclement between us and the enemy, namely the interrelation between the front of aggression and the front of peace. So, he says the enemy encircles China, the Soviet Union, France, and Czechoslovakia with his front of aggression, while we counter-encircle Germany, Japan, and Italy with our front of peace. And then he, expresses his certainty in final victory, right? This is a reference here to a classic Chinese novel, Journey to the West, Xiu Ji, where he says, our encirclement, like the hand of Buddha, will turn into the mountain of 5 elements lying athwart the universe, and the modern Sun Wukongs, the fascist aggressors, will finally be buried beneath it, never to rise again. I do have to fault Mao for doing Sun Wukong dirty. He is one of the most beloved characters in all of Chinese literature. So not very cool to associate him with the fascists. But other than that, extremely evocative image, right? And one that, for me, immediately evokes what has been going on, in the regional sphere, especially as we saw today, right? We go to the next slide. The regional axis of resistance extends way, way beyond historic Palestine itself. It's very hard, honestly, to find maps of it that aren't ideologically shit in terms of the captions. So there's some extra stuff going on here, but what it does show is the big actors, right? In addition to the Gaza-based resistance led by Hamas and Islamic Jihad, you have Hezbollah in Lebanon, you have the Islamic resistance in Iraq, you have Syria as a crucial conduit between the two, even after it's been destroyed, by over a decade of proxy war. You have Ansar Allah, aka the Houthis in Yemen, who have been, blockading, sort of maritime trade into the Red Sea, and in particular, essentially cutting off Israeli vessels there. And then you have, of course, the force that is often portrayed as the ringleader, right? The Islamic Republic of Iran, which in fact, as all members of the Axis, Iran included, have, pretty openly stated, does not exert operational control over all the other factions, right? That they deal with each other as equals. That Iran, in fact, uses its considerable industrial base in order to basically create open source designs, right? That the other members of the Axis can manufacture, and that for that reason, they then can come at Israel from a bunch of different directions, right? And this, in a very physical sense, represents the kind of counter-encirclement then of the entity that specifically within Palestine is encircling Gaza. And this very much is what Mao is speaking to. There's a lot happening in this other graphic, which is in Chinese on the right. I included it mostly because it has this close-up on the northern border of occupied Palestine with Lebanon, and emphasizing the fact that in unprecedented fashion, Hezbollah, right, has forced Israel to withdraw from a buffer zone up there. And then, of course, today we had, as a result of Israel's escalation, its direct attack on the Iranian embassy in Damascus, a counter reaction that has, for the first time, directly involved Iran. And right now, as we speak, I'm sure there are repercussions of that. Again, if you're on Twitter, feel free to interrupt me, with developments there. But this dynamic is absolutely crucial, right, to the ability of the resistance to endure, this long as well. And it has this antecedent, as I mentioned, in what Mao wrote about, in a global setting during World War II. Next slide. And then, the last aspect of this that I want to touch on is sort of the popular base for resistance that exists within Gaza, right? The popular cradle, as it's referred to in Palestinian parlance. So this relates to one of the most famous quotes by Mao on guerrilla warfare, namely that the relationship between the people and the guerrillas, right, is similar to that between water and the fish that inhabit it, right? And he notes that it is only undisciplined troops who make the people their enemies, and who, like the fish out of its native element, cannot live. So this speaks obviously to the need for discipline among the guerrillas, right, which was just as true for the resistance today, the armed resistance today, as it was for the Communist Party during the Civil War and the War of Resistance against Japan. But next slide. The sort of theoretical innovation that comes from really a century of Palestinian resistance is that the masses themselves have a complementary responsibility, right? And that's what's articulated by the popular cradle. As defined by the Palestinian Youth Movement, the popular cradle works as the organ of our struggle by conceptualizing resistance as both a normal and necessary state of being, and creating a resistance-enabling environment in which the masses financially, socially, and politically sustain the resistance and accept the consequences of supporting armed struggle against settler colonialism. So it takes many forms, right? One of the most famous ones is the keffiyeh itself, which was not at all a common, element of the wardrobe for the urban classes in Palestine until the Great Revolt, the Great Palestinian Revolt of 1936 to 39, when the leaders of the uprising essentially ordered that all classes of Palestinian society adopt it in order to make it hard to for the British occupiers and their Zionist proxies to identify resistance fighters, right? Who, coming from the rural areas, could be identified by their use of the keffiyeh. That's just one example of many, right? And really, the greatest testament to it, right, is pretty much Gaza in its entirety, and especially the way that the people of Gaza have withstood in the past 6 months of genocide, which have very intentionally come about from the fact that Israel understands this dynamic, and that the only way that they have to uproot Hamas and the rest of the resistance, right, is to literally destroy their popular cradle by destroying the population. So this ties in as well with another concept coming out of Mao, right? Not necessarily specific to guerrilla war, but which speaks in many ways to the broader social dynamic in which the resistance is embedded within Palestinian society, from which it draws its strength, and from which it draws its ideological influence and its evolution over time as well, right? we're talking about this a little bit more, but as I think a lot of people are aware, the resistance has sort of evolved, right, over the decades from being more like left nationalists or even overtly socialist or Marxist in character in the 60s and 70s during the high tide of national liberation struggles, taking more of an Islamist turn, right? And this is the reason why I think a lot of people on the broad Western left in particular have a hard time unconditionally supporting the resistance as it exists today, right? Because we've been conditioned to associate Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and so on with fundamentalism, right? With social reaction. But something that I am kicking myself for having only discovered after I wrote my article is that in fact, this transition was in many ways informed by a Maoist logic. There's this article that came out back in 2011 called Brothers in Arms, How Palestinian Maoists Turned Jihadists, about how the sort of Maoist faction within Fatah, during its period of retreat during the Lebanese Civil War, right, and also a political retreat into increasing accommodation of Zionism, essentially implemented this practice of the mass line, right, of going to the masses, of seeing where they're at, of bringing a certain level of theoretical and practical understanding, but also deriving from them a concrete embedded understanding of their own struggles, right, and incorporating that into one's own practice. They did this, and they wound up finding, perhaps ironically, that particularly in this era of global retreat for national liberation movements, of global retreat for the left, that what spoke to people most was actually not necessarily the language of socialism and Marxism, but of Islam, right? So, there's a very interesting quote from this article by Munir Shafiq, who was part of this Maoist faction of Fatah, and later went on to found the Islamic Jihad Brigade, which is very closely tied with what is today Palestinian Islamic Jihad. He said, "For years we have searched for the mass line, while directly lay before our eyes, but we didn't see it. Did you not see that Islam is the line of the masses in our countries? So by what logic do we look for characteristics of the revolution by saying that they're national democratic or socialist, while they're Islamic here, if we like it or not?" And so I thought that was really interesting, right? And it's a direct tie from the resistance as we see it today, right, with its particular political character, to the resistance that was sort of embraced in many ways more easily, right, by the global left and the Western left in the 60s and 70s. And that bridge is actually through a Maoist practice, right? So I thought that was super interesting. But it does sort of take us back in time, right? And I am going through this in a different order from the article, so hopefully that's not too disorienting. I'm sort of traveling back in time. But it takes us back finally to the era of concrete solidarity, right? In not just moral and diplomatic, but also material and military terms that occurred under Mao. The most famous visual legacy of which is this image of Palestinian Fedayeen in a refugee camp in Jordan, reading quotations from Chairman Mao, aka the Little Red Book. This is also what Emma, Tiger Stepmom's print is based on. So definitely check that out after the talk. But yeah, just to get into this a little bit more. Next slide. This is actually a relationship that predated the formation of the Palestine Liberation Organization itself. This again is something that I only discovered after putting the article out. But basically, in 1961, the Afro-Asian People's Solidarity Organization decided to meet in Gaza, right, which was then under basically Egyptian administration after the Nakba. And again, this was before there was like really a political organ specifically for the Palestinian national struggle. But nonetheless, its significance for literally this bicontinental or tricontinental struggle of national liberation was already apparent. And you can see that in the logo of the organization, which shows all of Asia, all of Africa, and then meeting right over Palestine, right? These two hands from different hemispheres, clenched in solidarity. This is a passage from an article in Ed magazine by Suleiman Hodali called "A Bond of the Same Nature," and basically goes over, a bunch of the different attendees at this conference. It included, communist and liberation icons from Kenya to Japan to India to Korea to the USSR, and then what sort of piqued my interest the most was at the end he names two attendees from China at this conference in Gaza, Yao Chengzhi and Burhan Shahidi. I don't know too much about the first guy, but the second is quite interesting because he was actually the first governor of Xinjiang, and he was an ethnic Uyghur, right? And this speaks to the fact that Chinese Islam, really from the beginning of the People's Republic, served actually as a bridge, to a really profound and deep solidarity with the cause of national liberation within the Arab world, within the Islamic world, and that the envoys that really helped build those ties and that cemented China's sort of anti-Zionist and pro-Palestinian commitments in this period, right, were themselves Chinese Muslims, whether from the Hui ethnicity or Uyghurs or any number of Turkic minorities as well, right? So that's a narrative, obviously, that today you don't hear much about. But this takes us to the high tide of the Palestinian struggle after the formation of the PLO, when China really came into its own as its foremost supporter among the great powers, right? So Yasser Arafat, for example, who for decades was the leader of the PLO, said that China was the biggest influence in supporting our revolution and strengthening its perseverance. And then, if Arafat in his later days becomes too problematic of a figure for you, then you have George Habash, the founder of the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, who said that our best friend is China. China wants Israel erased from the map because as long as Israel exists, it will remain an aggressive imperialist outpost on Arab soil. And to get a little bit into the specifics, though not nearly as in-depth as my article, China was actually the first non-Arab country to recognize the PLO diplomatically, just a year after its founding in 1965. Among the great powers, it was their exclusive supplier of arms, more or less, until 1970, because the Soviets wanted to basically maintain this balancing act involving Israel, involving the existing Arab governments, right? And not only that, but even after that point, China was basically the only great power to arm the resistance unconditionally. They did so really without ideological preference, right? Fatah did not have any sort of particular Marxist commitment, but because it was the leading faction of the struggle, China, more than anything else, emphasized the need for unity, right, among all the different factions. And so they extended their support to them as well as the others. They brought a number of PLO fighters and cadres to China for military ideological training. And you see here on the left, this is actually, funnily enough, from Haaretz, the Israeli paper, but it's basically from an explosives manual that, as you can see, is written in Chinese, but with like handwritten Arabic notes, right? And it's just one, manifestation of this continual exchange. And then on a popular level, every May 15th, which is Nakba Day, right? You had during these decades mass rallies of 100,000 people or more in Tiananmen Square in Beijing to mark Palestine Solidarity Day. So, you can see an example of one of these here. The banner says resolutely support the struggle of Palestinian Arab peoples against US imperialism and Zionism. And there's actually some video of this as well. I'll play here. This is from again, no subs, right? But this is basically the mass demonstration that happened after the 1967 war. And yeah, so here, basically in sequence, they're visiting the embassy of the PLO in Beijing. This basically popular delegation, right? And then afterwards, they go to the Egyptian and Syrian embassies as well. So, like a profound popular expression of solidarity with Palestine that very much extended beyond just the orientation of the state, right, and was very deeply embedded within society. Yeah. Ghassan Kanafani himself, this is something I discovered in the process of researching this article, actually visited China. I came to find this in a very roundabout way. Basically, this photo of him on the Great Wall showed up in my Twitter feed, and I was like, what the heck? I had no idea this happened. He actually wrote in Arabic, like an extended travelogue about his travels in China and India in 1965. And I'm not going to read this whole quote, but he wrote very movingly about what he experienced, right? About visiting not just like the classic sort of landmarks in Beijing and Shanghai and so on, but also mosques, agricultural collectives, right? And he said he wrote very movingly here about the phenomenon of poverty, which he certainly witnessed in abundance, right? But what he said, the Chinese are proud of what their bare hands can do while awaiting the future. They have put to work the 1,300 million arms they have to build the road to the future without a moment of waiting. Next slide. And this is something that I, again, discovered from this Ed magazine article after mine came out. But Kanafani actually came back to China in 1966 for a meeting of the Afro-Asian Writers Conference. There's some postage stamps here on the left that mark that occasion, some Chinese postage stamps. And this is a passage from Kanafani's biography where, this conference brought him in touch with Vietnamese liberation fighters as well as his Chinese hosts. And it says a North Vietnamese writer, after reading his speech, distributed to the other members of the Congress shrapnel souvenirs from the remains of an American plane which had been shot down a week before. Kanafani was immensely touched by this episode. When his turn came to speak, he did not read his prepared speech. Instead, he said he had nothing to offer in the way his North Vietnamese colleague had, but promised to do so at the next conference. Then he sat down and burst into tears. So you can imagine Kanafani, whom we all know to have been incredibly articulate in multiple languages, just rendered speechless, right? And Beijing was the venue for this. So, how am I doing on time? Okay, we got this. So Kanafani, do people know what happened to him?
He got killed by the Zionists.
He got killed by the Zionists.
In a car explosion.
Yeah, exactly. So they bombed his car in 1972. Do people know why, or what their pretext for that was? Obviously, they've been wanting to do it for a while, right? But they had a specific motive that they named. Mm-hmm.
He was an egg worker.
Got him. Yeah, I mean, obviously they didn't need a pretext, but they gave an explicit one for this assassination, which extended beyond just his involvement in the PFLP.
With the airport?
Yeah, so that the assassination of Kanafani, I kind of sort of gave it away a little bit on this slide already, but it came in response, supposedly, right, to the 1972 Lod Airport operation, which it's often described as a cold-blooded massacre, right, of Israeli civilians, if you want to call them that, and actually a bunch of Puerto Rican pilgrims who were there, at the main airport in Tel Aviv. So this occurred in 1971. The very interesting thing about it is that even though it was an operation carried out essentially, in coordination with the Palestinian resistance, it was actually conducted by 3 Japanese people. So you might be wondering, like, what the heck is up with that? And it turns out that, these 3 were all members of the Japanese Red Army. This was a guerrilla formation that came out of the very turbulent years of the Japanese New Left in the 60s. And they basically arrived at an analysis that, the best way for them to serve the cause of overthrowing, U.S. imperial rule over Japan, right, which had basically re-empowered, its fascist leaders from World War II, and turned the country into a base for imperial aggression throughout Asia, right, against Korea, against Vietnam, against China. But the best way for them to do that was not necessarily to stay at home, but actually to relocate themselves physically to the basis of world revolution, right? And at the time, they basically looked across the world map and they said, okay, where is the hotbed where we can intervene most effectively? It is in Palestine. They all relocated to Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon. And you see here on the left, the leader of the Japanese Red Army, Fusco Shigenobu, on the left, with Hassan Kanafani, in the offices of the PFLP magazine, which he edited, right? And they operated in very close military coordination with them for decades, basically. Their most spectacular operation was the Lod Airport operation in 1971, but they actually continued for decades afterwards, right? And they basically all made this commitment to spend, the next several decades of their lives, or possibly the entirety of them, either on the run or in hiding in Lebanon, right? And a very interesting piece of media came out of this. There's a poster for it on the right. It's this documentary called Sekigun PFLP, or Red Army PFLP, Declaration of World War. And I was actually introduced to this documentary and the story of the JRA by a comrade of mine in PYM during a reading group a couple years ago. But when I watched this documentary, a couple of surprises came up, right? Go to the next slide. And then just starting here, you can see about the PFLP practice of education, about the erasure of the difference between urban and rural guerrillas, and how they learn through practice on the battlefield. And of course, wait for it. Yeah, so they're all selling a little red book here as well, right? But even more moving to me, right, was this next little clip. So next slide, yeah. This should start at a different point. Or no, it isn't. Okay. Can you jump to 40 minutes and 36 seconds? Okay. All right, and then turn up the volume a little bit. So we all recognize the tune, right?
International.
Yeah, nationality. It's a little muffled, but can anyone tell what language it's in? Yeah, it's a little tough. This is actually in Chinese, right? And I'm gonna pause it. This made a huge impression on me when I was watching it, and in many ways, like this is all the way back in 2019 or something, but it served sort of as an inspiration for what became this article. It was just reflecting on how, in this documentary by a Japanese comedian, right? Only like 2.5 decades after the end of World War II, this vicious, colonial war waged against China by Japan, you had this dedicated, group of Japanese guerrillas who were so, inspired by the Chinese Revolution that they uprooted themselves, fought in solidarity with Palestine, on their battlefields, and then produced, this piece of media about it that prominently features as like a 5-minute interlude, all 3 verses of the Internationality in Chinese, right? And yeah, like it sort of got the gears running on how like the real basis, the glue, right, for this Pan-Asian revolutionary solidarity of sorts between the Japanese radical left and the Chinese radical left was in many ways forged by Palestine, on the complete other end of the continent. So yeah, I want to not end with that because I have a bit left to go, but to put that out there, right, as food for thought. So yeah, next slide. Yeah, one question that I had certainly was like, you had this wild story coming out of the Japanese left. Was there a Chinese equivalent, right? Because this was in the middle of the Cultural Revolution, which, at the state level, in diplomatic terms and rhetorically, had a very strong, commitment to internationalism at all levels of society. And unfortunately, I think the answer is probably no, that there was not actually like a Chinese foreign legion fighting with the PLO, though there were intriguing hints that there was interest in it, right? So there's this article from 1977, which said that in 71, Fatah stated that an undisclosed number of Chinese youths had volunteered to join the Palestinian guerrilla organizations through an offer made to the PLO office in Beijing. But there's no evidence that accepted that offer, and no evidence that that any Chinese people actually went abroad to fight with them. So, I asked, okay, what was the next best thing, right? Like, who could have been in some ways like the spiritual counterpart, at least, to the Japanese Red Army in China itself? And I recalled that somewhere in the recesses of my brain that I had read about this guy who had been a Red Guard in the Cultural Revolution, right? One of the rebellious youths who was inspired by Mao to overturn the entire existing order of society, and who later converted to Islam. And this was in the context specifically of a translated elegy that he had written for Osama bin Laden after his assassination. So I was like, whoa, okay. Very interesting ideological trajectory there. I need to learn more about this guy. I'm sure he had interesting things to say about Palestine. And lo and behold, he did. So I want to end basically with the story of this guy, Zhang Chengzhi. He was born in 1948 in Beijing to a Hui family. The Hui are an ethnic minority group in China that's traditionally Muslim, but he was raised secular. As I mentioned, he was not only a Red Guard, but he was the very first Red Guard of millions and millions in 1966 at the start of the Cultural Revolution. He was the very first one to sign one of his anonymous propaganda pamphlets, Gongweibing, or Red Guard. In marked distinction to almost the entire literary intelligentsia and establishment after the Cultural Revolution, he did not renounce that experience. In sort of the official historiography, and certainly among elites, right? The Cultural Revolution is pretty much written off entirely as 10 years of chaos. But he himself never repudiated what he called the Red Guard spirit. And very interestingly, he himself was sent down to the countryside, as with millions of other youths, during the Cultural Revolution. He came into contact with minority populations in Inner Mongolia, and then later in Northwest China, in particular, other Hui Muslims, right, in Western China. in particular, adherents to an order of Chinese Sufi Islam called the Jafiya. And he learned more and more about them and found that their historical experience of centuries of oppression and marginalization under dynastic rule, of rebellions, right, against the established order, very much vibed with him, right? He saw in them a reflection of the Red Guard spirit, very interestingly. And so in 1987, he, converted to Jafiya Islam. And then he spent the next 4 years writing an exhaustive history of Jafiya, right, called History of the Soul. As an aside, I found after writing the article that the origins of Jafiya actually came from a Chinese imam who studied in Yemen. So, again, very interesting historical resonance there. And then, in 2012, he made a very faithful visit to Palestinian refugee camps in Jordan, right? But well prior to that, he was standing in very profound solidarity with the Palestinian cause, both as a resolute anti-imperialist, as a Maoist, and as a Muslim, right? He combined all those functions together in a way that, for me, is very reminiscent of that Maoist to Islamist transition that I talked about earlier, involving the Palestinian resistance. But for him, he saw no essential contradiction there, right? He combined all of those ideological influences. So next slide. He wrote very movingly about Gaza on a number of occasions. I think this quote is from 2009, and it's translated, but he's talking about the Warsaw Ghetto, right? About a certain Jewish resistance fighter named Mordecai. And he says in 1943, Mordecai, a young man holding a grenade, stood up to the Nazis in the Warsaw Ghetto. However, Mordecai today is no longer a Jew, but a Palestinian living in a ghetto called Gaza. Countless young people who support Hamas in its fight with Israel are today's Mordecai. The enemy they face is no longer the Nazis, but the Nazified Israel. So this, of course, is very resonant, with the language that today has finally become commonplace, right? In terms of characterizing Israel as an expressly fascist project, comparing Gaza, the destruction of Gaza, with that of the Warsaw Ghetto. And he was saying this back in 2009, right? In Chinese circles. Next slide. Again, this is a quote from, I think, the 2014 Israeli, attack on Gaza, which, basically it could apply just as well today, right? He wrote that in the footage captured by Gaza refugees on their mobile phones, corpses are piled up, blood is spattering, people are crying, children are wailing in horror at their broken legs. Can a civilized magazine print rows of baby corpses wrapped in shrouds? Can today's readers accept photos of fathers crying while holding the bodies of their little daughters whose legs or arms were blown off, whose intestines were blown out? Even though the media does not act as an intermediary, news still spreads rapidly. Every tear, every drop of blood, every speechless corpse is spread in despair and subconsciously. It is sent to Tencent, Facebook, and all networks. It is sprinkled with salt into the sea and spread to thousands of homes around the world. I have not been able to find anything that he's written about the current genocide. But nonetheless, this obviously stands just as much today, right? And every aspect of it, right? Whether the horror of the violence, right? The amplification of it through alternative media channels, all of it is dialed up to 11. And just to return to the theme of the Japanese Red Army and Pan-Asianism, John Chenzo also spent a lot of time in Japan, right? He wrote an entire essay collection about his years there, you see on the left. And he in particular got very interested in the story of the Japanese Red Army and Fusco Shigenobu. And he had this to say, which for me perfectly encapsulated, all these inchoate feelings that I had after seeing that documentary, right? He wrote that facing the sinister history of Japan's 150-year history of enslaving its neighbors in Asia, only the Arab Japanese Red Army went against the grain and rebelled, defying Japan's colonial project of leaving Asia to join Europe. As the name suggests, the Arab-Japanese Red Army was a group of sons and daughters of Japan who threw themselves into the Arab world, that is, into the embrace of Mother Asia. And so this, this really perfectly encapsulates everything, right, that had been brought together for me in terms of Palestine, right? Palestine's liberation struggle as a fulcrum, certainly for global liberation, but specifically for providing a basis for Pan-Asianism in a time when U.S. imperialism, right, when the Cold War divide and the way that it entrenched the previous co-optation and betrayal of that project by Imperial Japan, that Palestine has really stood out as the force that can overcome all that baggage. And, for Asian peoples, right, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and then throughout South Asia and Central Asia, as well as West Asia, aka the Middle East, the whole continent, right? That it can identify in the Palestinian cause, a liberation struggle that is so resonant with and so reminiscent of all of these, respective local ones, right? Whether in the past or in the present. And so I wanted to wrap sort of with that, right? And with also its importance for those of us in the diaspora, right? Whether the broader Asian diaspora or any diaspora, right? Here in the imperial core, right? To be attentive to those shared histories, right? To the ways that Palestine has shown up in perhaps very unexpected ways as a central suturing element of all of them, and to sort of deepen our own solidarity work with Palestine with that history in mind. And so to wrap up, I want to talk a little bit about this trip that Johnson took to Jordan to visit 5 Palestinian refugee camps in 2012. Because what he did in advance of this was he issued a new limited edition of his magnum opus, right, History of the Soul, on the history of the Jaffa movement. And he used all the proceeds from that. He basically took all the proceeds from that, right, which in many cases, he sort of went around the country to different Muslim communities and asked them to contribute, and many of them did, right, above and beyond as a form of zakat, right, as a form of almsgiving. And took all the proceeds and he went to Jordan and basically distributed them to 400 plus Palestinian refugee families living in these camps. So here's a photo of that. And, as humble a contribution as that was, right, it amounted to about $100,000, which is a drop in the bucket, obviously, compared to the cumulative needs, right? I think its symbolic importance really outweighed that by orders and orders of magnitude, because it was given in an act not just of religious obligation in this case, but of anti-imperialist solidarity. And with that, I wanted to wrap up my part and then give the floor to Emma Lee, aka Tiger's stepmom, to talk a little bit about the fundraiser that she is supporting.
I created this artwork of them reading the Little Red Book, and also with Saeed right here. I have a bunch of totes available for sale here, and also an order form for shirts and sweatshirts and other stuff. But all proceeds from this are going to the evacuation fund for my family in Gaza. Currently, we've raised about $30,000, and that was enough to register for family members to evacuate. But we're looking to raise enough to cover enough for her 11 other family members to evacuate. They're in Nusrat camp right now in central Gaza, which they're besieged in their homes because of how heavy the bombing is in their neighborhood. So please keep central Gaza in your thoughts right now, especially Nusrat camp. I know there's a lot going on right now with
Iran and also some on-campus repression stuff, but please keep the attacks in Central Gaza and the impending Rafah invasion in your thoughts. And yeah, just anybody who is interested in ordering anything, and again, all proceeds are going to this acquisition fund. Thank you.
Right. I guess we can open up for Q&A now, but I also wanted to, mention that, first of all, express my gratitude to All Power for giving us this space. And, please take a look at any of the merch that they have. Try and kick them a couple bucks to keep the space running, because this really, is unique as a community center, as a forum for events like these, and we want to keep it that way.
Thank you. Awesome. So we have about like 30 minutes more or less for questions if anybody wants to ask them. I don't think the cord is long enough, but if you just project your voice, that should be loud enough.
I have a question. I was recently watching a documentary about the Dokla War, and it was so interesting because it was very similar to what Palestine is going through, but they were fighting against British imperialists. They too were being labeled as terrorists in the media. This was like the 1960s. And the government was basically saying that they were being told what to do by Chairman Mao. And they were all reading that. Can you talk more about like how they were introduced to that? Like why the Red Book was such a significant piece of literature for guerrillas all over the world? And why I guess British and just imperialists use that as such a negative aspect for these guerrilla resistance fighters.
You want to answer one question at a time?
Let's do like maybe two at a time. So one out there.
Yeah. I just want to, add to what Savannah is saying. It's not just, that group, but I guess I'm just curious what you have to say about the link between national liberation and Marxism in general. Because a lot of countries that when they tend to fight against imperialism tend to find Marxism as a material base or a source for inspiration for their struggle. And I guess my second question is, can you talk a little bit about the mass line and what that meant?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Dhofar revolution was in Oman, I believe, right? I wish I knew more about it. I kind of know the basics, I suppose. And I can't really necessarily speak to how they in particular came into contact ideologically with, Maoism as an overall theoretical framework. But in terms of being a guide to the waging of guerrilla war for them, for the all the various Palestinian factions at this time, right? In a way that has outlasted, the ideological centrality of Marxism itself, right, to the main current of the Palestinian liberation struggle. Like they're still referring to Mao, even from the standpoint, the ideological foundations of Ansar Allah or Hezbollah, or the staying power of it, I think, comes from a number of sources. One is just empirically its demonstrated success, right, in liberating the most populous country on earth from, not just foreign imperialism, right, multiple foreign imperialisms in succession, but also, a vicious sort of domestic comprador regime that had almost destroyed it on several occasions, right? Like these different phases of the Chinese Revolution, involved like what was left of the Communist Party and the Red Army, like, being on their last legs and seemingly with no hope on so many different occasions. The Long March probably being the most famous example. There was a great talk by Ken Hammond about that at the People's Forum this past week. I encourage people to check that out. But yeah, I think the variety of different experiences, right, that this body of thought called Mao Zedong thought was drawing upon, the visibility of the Chinese Revolution, right, simply by virtue of China's size and its centrality to the world system, but also the fact that if you look at, for example, national liberation struggles within the United States, right, whether the Black liberation struggle, many indigenous liberation struggles, right, as well as the early Asian American movement. They identified China in sort of contradistinction to the USSR as specifically like a non-white, third world, or today we would say global South country, right, that had freed itself, and as one whose social realities, right, in terms of having a population that was overwhelmingly rural, right, belonging to like an oppressed peasant class under feudalism, sort of multiply oppressed, not only by that, but also by global capitalism and by U.S. imperialism, right, as a situation that had many parallels to their own. And so, yeah, it was sort of like identifying those parallels, identifying sort of the breadth of experience that the CPC like had to undergo in the course of that struggle, and also, just the very practical way in which these writings are framed, right? Like, there's very little kind of unnecessarily abstruse theoretical terminology or anything like that to Mao's writings. They're like super accessible, and that helps in terms of translation. That helps in terms of like just any sort of literate Korea fighter picking it up in their own language and seeing its immediate applicability to their fight. I think this speaks as well to part of Nato's question about relating Marxism to national liberation, because in terms of successfully waging even just the political element of the liberation struggle, right, namely the securing of national independence from a colonial power, it's really crucial to understand the political economy of the colonial dynamic, right? And Marxism offers a scientific understanding of that, and one that is expressly geared towards the overthrow of that system, right? Conversely, for ideologically committed Marxists around the world, including and especially in the imperial core, I think a bedrock condition to national liberation is absolutely necessary for the reasons articulated by that Kanafani quote at the beginning, right? That national liberation is a crucial precursor, to weakening the hold of imperialism on all these regions in the world from which it, derives, the wealth, right, and the capital that is in turn used to oppress us in all of these variegated ways that are differentiated, along lines of nationality and race and gender and so on in the imperial core as well, right? What was the first part of your question, Nato?
Just what is the mass line?
Yes, the mass line. Yeah, so I kind of alluded to this during that one slide, which I like snuck in there. I couldn't really figure out where it fit, and I decided it was basically in tandem with the popular cradle because they're related concepts. But the mass line is basically an organizational principle articulated by Mao for the Communist Party, where the party would not like stand above society at large, right, and simply like dictate in a unidirectional way, like this is the way that you need to be organized. This is our political program, and this is how you're going to fit into it, right? But the party would be a vehicle for cultivating, like politically experienced and politically educated cadres, right? Who would be drawn from the masses and who would be embedded within, mass society, and who would engage in a conscious practice of, holding mass meetings, right? Of approaching them with humility and sort of, as their first move, right, to gather, from the masses and all of their complexity with all their contradictions, right? Just data, right? Just information about what are your concrete struggles, right, with your landlord, or with your husband, who is oppressing you, or just yeah, essentially all of the compounded, like frustrations that emerge out of all these interlocking systems of oppression, right? And then use that then to reevaluate, to reassess their own political program, right? While, in turn, in this iterative process, then going back to the masses, right? And saying, okay, I've listened to you, I've heard you, right? Here is my understanding, right, of how these fit in with, like a common structure of oppression and exploitation that's at their root. What do you think the next step should be, right? And then building out that operational program, again, with the full involvement of the masses, in such a way that the masses themselves, right, are shaped into a political vehicle for their own liberation, in which they need to be active protagonists, and in which the party can't just step in as an external force and say, we're liberating you, right? Because that never works. Any questions?
Would you consider yourself a Maoist, one? And do you think that the reason why Mao is so looked down upon is like he's a murderer and he caused this huge famine that kills a bunch of his people? Like, do you think that all of that comes from just how effective Maoism is as an ideology? And like, how would you fight back against that narrative from people that are like curious about Maoism or like on the fence about it, or just outright think like, oh, Mao is a murderer, like I couldn't consider that as an ideology?
That's a really good question. So especially in like a Western setting, Maoism as a term specifically carries connotations that are like highly sectarian, and that involve the characterization of basically post-Mao China as well as the USSR for most of its history, and of most actually existing socialist projects as, quote, revisionist, right? As deviations from this sort of like maximal revolutionary program. And unfortunately, a lot of that does stem from the rhetorical maximalism of China during the Mao period as well, right? In terms of these like anti-revisionist polemics. And I think they lead to like a self-marginalizing dynamic among groups of self-described Maoists today, especially in the West, where they think like the only option for us, right, the only viable route to revolution is sort of a mechanical cookie cutter reproduction of what the CPC did during its long road to power, right? So this usually involves like going to the countryside, whatever the countryside is in your context, right? Setting up revolutionary base areas, waging people's war. And the thing is that like China itself, while I think like in the Mao period, it did, engage in a lot of rhetorical excesses, and certainly bore its share of the blame for the Sino-Soviet split. And then like basically condemning alternative models of socialism. It never itself like argued for mechanical export of its own revolutionary model, right? That's something that particularly Western Maoists, usually using like either Shining Path in Peru or the New People's Army in the Philippines or the Naxalites in India as their reference points, have like picked up for themselves, right? So I would not consider myself a Maoist of that type, but I do think there is a lot to be gained from creatively learning from and applying this broader body of Mao Zedong thought, which remains core to the Communist Party of China's sort of self-understanding today, right? I think that remains something that is applicable to all revolutionary struggles, but you have to really think through like the specifics, right? And then regarding the demonization of Mao personally, that is also a complicated question because the specific historical episodes to which the Mao period is reduced in China, right, which are basically just the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. Like in the conventional Western understanding, like that entire 30-year period is reduced to just those, right? And it's true that like the Communist Party today, right, itself has repudiated both of those specific experiences as grievous errors, right? And did a wholesale self-critique after now a sort of complete like reevaluation of the relative primacy of ideological struggle versus economic development, right? In ways that some would say with I think some reason, right? Like have bent the stick too far in the other direction. That said, I think that like all of those events, right? The great like tragedies and human losses and grievous errors have to be understood in their proper context of a really wrenching process of socialist construction under siege, right? Not just from the West, but eventually from the Soviet Union as well. That was operating on fairly unexplored terrain in really inopportune circumstances, and itself had so many sort of internal contradictions to work through, and which nonetheless not only survived, right, but ultimately provided incredible material gains in literacy, in public health, in life expectancy, in education, right, in industrial development that became the basis for China's meteoric rise since then, right? And they have to be understood in that context, and that is the context in which they're understood today, right? I think that within China, there's still some contestation about the specifics of those events of the Great Leap Forward, of the Cultural Revolution, right? The specific numbers who died in each, right? The relative like value or not of embarking on those drives at sort of hypercharged industrialization or political radicalization, right? But the common understanding rooted in the experience of the people, right, both from that time and now, is that they are far from representing the full picture, right, of socialist construction in China, and the precise reason why it's those two events and only those two, more or less, that get trotted out in the West is, I think, precisely as you articulated, in order to demonize, right, the entire Chinese socialist project and the Mao period in particular, in a way that constitutes not just an anti-Maoist like ideological war, but a general anti-communist ideological war, and one that now is compounded, right, by the escalation all of these other new Cold War narratives against China, which constitute in their entirety, I would say, like a hybrid war, against China, against its developmental model, against its increasing re-identification with the global South and with its continuing liberation struggles, which is a very, very welcome development, some of whose manifestations I talked about. And one that, while aimed primarily at Western audiences, also has a dimension that is targeted within China, right? At the intelligentsia, at all the social forces that the West still believes can be the agents of a slow process of regime change, and take China back out of this anti-imperialist camp that it is sort of making big moves toward fully re-entering, right?
There's a quote that you didn't mention, Mao, in one of his last speeches, that the new positive for the hope for Palestine. For one of his last speeches, which is a weak nation can defeat a strong, a small nation can defeat a big. The people of a small country can certainly defeat aggression by a big country. If only they dare to rise and struggle, dare to take up arms and grasp in their own hands the destiny of their country. That is the law of history. So it's a positive outlook for Palestine being able to free themselves from the imperialist rule of Israel, and for, as it says, all their money dollars.
You showed a bit about like all like the really explicit material support that China was providing in the Mao period. When did that taper off? Was there some specific event, or like was it because of the shifting of power in China? Is it just because now the world's too like interconnected that kind of like explicit support is not possible anymore? What characterizes that shift?
Yeah, great question, Gage. First of all, amen to that quote. And I think that what it speaks to is the enduring identification of China, even during the height of the reform period and the rapprochement with the U.S., right, with the plight of small countries, small in a literal sense, right, even as China very much is not that, because it understands itself as part of the third world, the global South, and has never wavered from that understanding. However, to speak to Gage's question, the concrete manifestations of that have undoubtedly shifted, right, with the coordinates of global politics generally. In regards to certainly the Palestinian liberation struggle, but also others around the world, right? One thing to recognize that is fairly unique about Palestine is how just long and protracted of like a liberation struggle, an anti-colonial liberation struggle in the classical sense it has been, right? It already was a bit of a historical exception in that you had like just blatant, settler colonialism of the kind of model that was much more common globally, centuries before, but starting, in the early 20th century, and then really getting shifted up to another level in 1948 and up, right? So in that sense, it already, was like out of the historical current in a sense. And the fact that it's persisted this long, right? After so many other liberation struggles that mutually supported the Palestinian one, right? Whether the Vietnamese, all these African decolonization struggles, once they secured sort of formal independence and sovereignty, right? That marked, inevitably, like a reversal in some ways of the tide of national liberation, right? And not in a way that came about purely because of their formal success, right, in terms of securing political independence, but also because the counterinsurgent strategy of the imperialist bloc shifted, right? They gave up their colonies. They gave, the U.S. gave up its attempt to subjugate Vietnam overtly, right? But their sort of toolkit of neocolonial methods of control, really came to the fore in that moment, right? And this had, its undeniable effects in China and Palestine as well. In the case of China, they sort of converged with these internal political dynamics of exhaustion, right, with sort of nonstop revolutionary mobilization that came after the Cultural Revolution, whose role in sort of like discrediting the far left, like is still has ramifications today, right, in Chinese politics, and led to this, as I mentioned, reorientation towards rapprochement with the U.S., right, in a geopolitical sphere, at the precise moment that the U.S. was also shifting its policy vis-a-vis the global South to a model of NGOization, right, of like financialization, of neoliberalism, of full-blown neocolonialism that also had its effects in Palestine, right? Because there, at a military level, the Palestinian armed struggle also suffered grievous setbacks, right? In 1970, it was expelled from Jordan after the failure of the Black September uprising against the monarchy. It relocated to Lebanon, and then the civil war broke out there. And then Israel invaded in '82. To brutally suppress, in particular, like all of the hotbeds of resistance within the refugee camps. And the PLO was forced again to relocate, like, completely outside of the immediate environs of historic Palestine to Tunisia, right? And that initiated sort of the dynamic wherein, like, shorn of so many of its military allies, right? Like the official organs of the Palestinian national movement, namely the PLO, which was recognized as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, like, went, in this like sort of slow descent into normalization with Israel, right, which culminated, of course, in the Oslo Accords, and in the sort of unreciprocated recognition of Israel by the PLO in exchange for some vague promise of future statehood, and in the interim, right, of the PLO literally being turned into, a collaborationist and counterinsurgent apparatus against its own people, right? But at the international level, what did that do? It meant that the PLO, which was designated as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, had normalized with Israel, which meant that every country that recognized Palestine, that had diplomatic relations with the PLO, right, including China, then had essentially covered, right, to normalize with Israel themselves. And the fact that this happened in conjunction basically with the fall of the USSR meant that you had, like, I think I counted something on the order of like 25 or so, mostly ex-socialist countries, all of them, sort of diplomatic allies of Palestine, right? Who, because, of the negotiations leading up to Oslo, like, suddenly established relations with Israel in that 2-year span, right, between 1991 and 1993, when the accords were signed. And, that meant that, China, which, itself had already started making these economic overtures to Israel for various reasons, right, in advance of this, it was kind of just going with the flow, right, in terms of normalizing with Israel itself in 1992. And that kind of, puts us more or less where we're at today, right, where, as with any other country in the global South that has diplomatic relations with both Palestine and Israel, namely the vast majority of them, China rhetorically, at an official level, still endorses the two-state solution because that's what the PLO is still committed to, right? And because the PLO, even though it's so delegitimized at a popular level, is still the sole legitimate representative. And this is an internal contradiction within the Palestinian national movement that the resistance is sort of like forcing now, into the spotlight, right? And which hopefully, will force a resolution to that will, at the end of this phase of it, be much more a much more propitious basis, right, for the full liberation of Palestine from the river to the sea. But given all these dynamics, and given the fact that China's own diplomatic posture shifted from one of like overt support for armed liberation movements to one of like mutual recognition and non-interference, right? It means that like China is not going to be one of those countries that China today, right, is not going to be one of those countries that sticks its neck out in terms of cutting off relations with Israel, whether diplomatically or economically. The way that I could see it happening, or starting to happen, is if Israel at some point makes the mistake of crossing China's red lines in bilateral diplomatic relations, right? Like say, China, once again says something about the legitimacy of armed resistance, pisses off Netanyahu or someone in his government, and then they, start endorsing Taiwan independence, right? Then that would become, a pretext within the logic of bilateral diplomatic relations for China to cut off those ties. It's similarly to what happened in Brazil, right, where Lula kind of took his sweet time, then eventually made this statement comparing Israel to the Nazis, and then the Israelis were so outraged at this that they declared Lula persona non grata, right? And then that was the diplomatic faux pas in bilateral terms that led to Brazil cutting off relations. If that happens in the case of China and Israel, I think it would be something like that.
We have time for one more question. Anything?
I think the comrade mentioned this at the beginning, but what would you say to people who are like, what, the genocide of the Uyghurs?
Thank you. I knew I was going to get that question. In fact, I was openly welcoming it, though I didn't really have time to address it in the talk specifically. I would say, first of all, that, we at Xiao Collective actually back in 2020 put out a very extensive resource list on Xinjiang. And it is focused primarily on the last several decades, right? But as sort of crucial background to that, there are a couple of things that need to be made very clear about like the, just the objective realities of Xinjiang as an autonomous region and of the Uyghurs as one of China's 55 ethnic minorities as well, which is that China has since the founding of the PRC had an express constitutional commitment to overturning the oppressive relations in which the Han majority in particular has had with other minorities, right? The Constitution explicitly rejects Han chauvinism, right, in relation to other ethnicities above all else. And this is not just a rhetorical commitment; it is actualized in a system of regional ethnic autonomy, which in the case of Xinjiang means that it is an Uyghur autonomous region. And what that means is that all primary and I think secondary education is fully bilingual, right, in Mandarin and Uyghur. Uyghur is also co-equal with Mandarin Chinese as a language of government and administration. And this extends to religion as well. Xinjiang, in fact, has the highest, I believe, the highest concentration of mosques per capita anywhere outside the Arab world. And this gets at a deeper fact, which is that we're taught to think of relations between racialized Muslim peoples and non-Muslim peoples here in the West as through a lens that is ineluctably colored by the history of specifically Western and specifically European Islamophobia, right? Going all the way back to the Crusades, this understanding of Muslims as as this racialized other, right? And that has no parallel whatsoever to the case of China, where Muslims of all different ethnicities, right, including the non-Turkic like Hui ethnicity that Zhang Cunzi belonged to, that yeah, they and Islam as a religion have been part and parcel of Chinese society since several decades after the time of the Prophet Muhammad, like literally since like 700 AD, right? And that is something that very much continues today. And in this respect, we have to understand that like both the stated intention and the practical consequence of the like sort of recent de-radicalization programs, right, that have been implemented in Xinjiang is not anti-Islamic in orientation. It is not like directed at the Uyghurs as an ethnicity, right? There are perhaps ways in which like the like the sort of surveillance apparatus or the carceral apparatus has kind of inevitably, right, been abused in individual cases. But the thrust of the de-radicalization program is directed at very much specific minoritarian tendencies within within Xinjiang, principally like Salafi jihadist Islam, which is very much foreign to the region, right? As it is in a lot of Arab countries as well, right? Uyghur people in Xinjiang are overwhelmingly Sufi Muslim, and Salafism is therefore a foreign import, and one that is also very closely tied with political separatism, right? So, I guess what I would say is, whatever measures have been taken, right, like that we know about, that we have evidence for, like they are not in any way extraordinary, right, for any state that is concerned for its integrity. They like the actual scale of them, has been wildly overblown in Western media, right? And if you look at sort of the diplomatic picture, of where different countries stand, like it's pretty much exclusively Western countries, right, that endorse the Xinjiang genocide narrative, and virtually the entire global South, including the entire Organization of Islamic Cooperation, right, many of whose members are, themselves, essentially like close allies or proxies of the U.S., right? Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and so on. All of them reject those narratives. So it's one that was pretty much created for Western consumption, right? That bears little, if any, relation to the realities on the ground. And at a more fundamental level as well, the accusation has also been thrown of a more limited concept called cultural genocide or of settler colonialism, right? And these also bear no relation to reality, because if you look at Xinjiang geographically, the Uyghurs themselves, their sort of traditional homeland has always been in the southern part of the region, and they still constitute about close to 90% of the population there. So no one was displaced, right? Certainly, yeah, not any like, to say nothing of actual settler colonialism on the scale that we see in Palestine. And yeah, in terms of the language, in terms of the religion, in terms of all aspects of culture, their sort of preservation is actively promoted, right? This isn't to say that there aren't contradictions, particularly in the period of market reforms, right? Where suddenly having, for example, in Uyghur only primary education would put you at disadvantage in a liberalized job market, right? And it was through that introduction of sort of more capitalist relations, that you start to see something of a growing wealth and income gap between Han and non-Han peoples in Xinjiang, right? That's a dynamic that these de-radicalization programs, which are combined with vocational education, are intended to be something of a first gesture at rectifying. They're probably not enough, and at the end of the day, what I think is certainly the case is that 1949, the Chinese Revolution, throughout the entire territory of China, represented a sharp break with centuries and millennia of accumulated histories of social oppression, of Han chauvinism, and what they represented, and what that revolution represented moving forward, right? Was a vision for a multi-ethnic socialist society, in which all its peoples have a place, right, with their own, collective expressions of their national and ethnic identity, and that is an ideal that I think, China is still committed to, albeit imperfectly, with many contradictions. But the revival of the genocide narrative in particular, at a time when we see live streamed from Gaza what an actual genocide looks like, is, I think, not just off base, but like incredibly offensive, to the victims of actual genocide at like a very visceral level.
All right, thank you so much.
I just want to follow up, like, what do you call the internal migration of 40 million Han-Chinese to Xinjiang? And like, how do you compare sort of like East Turkestan, like a self-determining Turkic people who want their own country? How do you compare that Muslim people with the Muslim people in Gaza who want their own country? How do you hold these two concepts at the same time and say that one deserves to have self-determination and one doesn't?
Yeah, so regarding the migration question, right? I think you have to distinguish between, first of all, yeah, 40 million is, I think, 4 times too high for the.
To where? Urumqi?
To Xinjiang.
你告诉我，在中国写法，在哪里说 unchauvinism？
啊？
你能听到我说话吗？你会说汉语？
那当然可以的，对。
那你告诉我，中国写法在哪里说这个 unchauvinism？
Can you repeat your question in English?
Yeah, my bad. So like, can you like? I lived in China for 3 years. Like, Han chauvinism may be written into the Chinese Constitution, but it does exist. It's practiced everywhere in Beijing and in China. Uyghur street vendors are discriminated against and treated like shit in that country. So, like, I do not deny what is going on.